From awareness to architecture, how boards can build a geopolitical risk system. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries, and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learning from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. In the previous episode, we explored the gap between how seriously boards take geopolitical risk and how poorly most organizations actually manage it. The response we got was clear. The problem is recognized, but the big question is, so what? What shall we actually do about it, and how can we go about it? And this is exactly what this episode is about, moving from diagnosis to design. Most organizations do not lack awareness of geopolitical risks, but they do lack a system for dealing with it. They have no structured process for scanning the environment, assessing exposure, escalating what matters, and feeding insights into decisions at pace in the boardroom. The organizations that do this well treat geopolitical risks the way they treat financial risks or cybersecurity risks, as a routine discipline with layers, clear roles, clear accountabilities, rather than as an occasional agenda item. So today we will get more practical. We will walk through the layers a board needs to think about when building a geopolitical risk system, hear real examples from different industries, and discuss what boards can realistically put in place regardless of their size and sector. I'm delighted to welcome back Colin Reed. Colin is the Chief Intelligence Officer at Clock&Cloud. It's a software startup transforming how large enterprises manage geopolitical risk. But what's interesting, before he basically developed Clock&Cloud, Colin was Salesforce's first ever geopolitical risk manager. So he built up the geopolitical risk management function at Salesforce. And before that, he was a senior intelligence analyst in the US government. So someone who really understands geopolitical risk and how to translate these risks into operational issues. I'm really delighted that we could convince him to join the Better Boards podcast series. Colin, welcome back to the Better Boards podcast series.
Thank you so much for having me back. It was so fun the first time. I decided to come back a second time.
That's fantastic. And, we got such an amazing response to the first episode that, of course, we couldn't help but do a second one. But it was already in the planning anyway, because in the first episode, we talked about this gap between awareness and concrete actions when it comes to geopolitical risks. In this episode, we want to go deeper and really go from how can they close this gap? How can boards really build a geopolitical risk system?
No, please. I was just going to go ahead and jump in and respond. I'm obviously so passionate to talk about this. The last time we talked about the first step to understanding your risk is to audit your risk. You need to understand where you are in the world, what worries you, what your critical dependencies are. The reality is there's no business that's starting from zero today when it comes to managed geopolitical risk. It's been 6 years since the pandemic. It's been 4 years since Russia conducted its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There are definitely aspects of your business that are exposed to geopolitical risk, and there are definitely parts of your business that are already actively managing it. So the first step is to look across your business, conduct that audit, see where's the risk and who are my managers that are already handling it. And then the second aspect that we talked a little bit about before is identifying a good corporate champion that can be the single place where all of those people get together, convene, talk about the problems they face and the solutions they're trying to come up with to manage it. Those people internal to your company will be your guides that will show you where you need to then go on and make further improvements.
But let's go now a little bit further down the road, because frankly, I see too many board members who sit like the rabbit in front of the headlight at the moment. Yeah. So let's say you've done it. I mean, the first steps, as you described, you've done it. How can you now really go and build up this geopolitical risk system? And what does a good system really look like?
Yeah, I think this is the meat and potatoes, so to speak. So in order to ensure that the company's directors and leadership stay active on this, I think it's super helpful for the geopolitical risk management structure to adhere to the way the business already works. So different companies have different cultures. They have different ways of communicating information. I think that's going to be up to you as the internal guide to identify what's the best way to capture the business's attention, because businesses, like people, have shorter and shorter attention spans these days. So you need to be able to capture attention and sustain it, particularly when it comes to looking into the future at risks that may seem like they're a little science fiction today. What has worked for me in the past, and it's a model that I know many in the industry are adopting now, is something like a council model or a working group model. So at Salesforce, we created what was called the Geopolitical Strategy Council. This was a body that was comprised of all of the risk managers that were dealing with any aspect of geopolitics across the business. We had a representative from the legal team. We had a representative from the supply chains procurement team. We had representatives from the sustainability and due diligence teams. Obviously, I was at this time sitting within the security team, so we were well represented there as well. But yeah, all the aspects of the business. We even included folks from go-to-market, from the sales team. We really wanted it to be all-inclusive. Those working groups, we would convene them quarterly in person. And this was something that was key for us because Salesforce was big tech company, super remote culture. People were distributed all over the world. It was still late pandemic days. So getting people out from behind their cameras into a room was something that we found actually gave us a lot of impact. It made things seem quite tangible and real to people. So we would bring people together quarterly for at least a day or two. We would always arrange for a super interesting speaker or topic or provocation as the kickoff for this to get people in the right frame of mind. This was always fun for me because my job was to sit there and think about what's coming down the pipeline in geopolitics over the next 6 months. Can I see around the next corner, see beyond the headlines of what's exciting today, put a speaker in front of our people that gives them something to think about that they may not have been thinking about when they showed up Monday morning, then gets us proactive in managing risk. And we really didn't want to devote too much of the time of those meetings to the speaker. We really wanted that to be the scene setter. It's interesting for people that don't spend most of their day dealing with geopolitics to get to have a little break and think about what's coming, in the world and what's new. And because these people tended to be the curious types in their orgs anyway, they were the ones that were interested to engage with this stuff. But once that speaker would come through, then we would spend a pretty structured period of time going around and talking to everybody about where geopolitical risk was manifesting for them in their current operations and trying to provoke them on, here's what our forward-looking risk intelligence team sees coming down the line. If that were to happen, what would it do to your part of the business? We would assemble all of that information together after that day or two of really intense working. And we would then make that available not only to the members of the group, but also through our sponsor to the C-suite and the board. And we felt like this established a pretty proactive mechanism for messaging from the grassroots all the way up to the leadership about where the risk was. And increasingly, the feedback we got from the C-suite and the board was that this was exactly what they needed because, it kind of existed outside of the normal regulatory requirement of governance. So it gave them an opportunity to think about this stuff in an unstructured way rather than as a tick box exercise. Hey, the 10K is due. We've got to write something for geopolitical risk.
It still sounds like quite a big effort, doesn't it? I mean, how can boards and how can the people actually manage this? Because let's face it, the agendas of everyone are full.
It definitely could be a big effort. And I think this is where it's important that you right size the solution to the problem. If you are a small firm that does not have a huge geopolitical risk exposure, it probably does not make sense to do everything that I just said. Instead, you can probably handle this in a much more light touch way. What I will say is that the most successful solutions that I've seen here are ones that are maybe like 5% more extra than you would think that they need to be. And the reason that I frame it that way is that I think if you allow people to always do this only when they have time, it quickly becomes not proactive enough. And so what you end up with is a situation where you think you're saving time now by not engaging with this kind of stuff. But then when a crisis hits, it becomes all consuming and all the other business activities have to stop because then now there's a crisis and we're scrambling to deal with it. So the provocation that I would always give to our senior leaders was, if you can make the time quarterly to deal with this, I will save you at least 2 weeks a year managing a crisis that will come along. And we found that was usually the case. I think it's a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of a stick. You have to make it appealing and interesting, but also you have to kind of remind people that risk is unpleasant and no one wants to spend the time dealing with it, but it is something that if you don't do it, it will come and find you eventually. You might be lucky for a while, but you won't be lucky forever.
Let's make this really tangible and look at some real practical examples here. You mentioned it's, of course, a difference depending in which industry you are. Let's look maybe at two big sectors, a manufacturing company and a financial service firm.
Sure. I think that's a good one. And maybe I'll even add one more, which is a technology firm, because I think they have an even different, again, picture. So a major industrial firm has different things that they care about, things that are most risky for them to the other two. In particular, the things that probably matter the most to the industrial are the supply chain exposures. So that has to do with shipping routes, but it also has to do with things like component sourcing and critical raw materials. And that can go really far down the supply chain. Managing risk in that environment is about understanding your suppliers, about understanding how materials flows will affect you, about understanding the geopolitics behind those things. It's been in the news quite a bit recently that China obviously has really focused on being able to go across the critical raw materials supply chain and dominate most of those sectors. So what that means is that even if you're not active in China as a business, you're definitely exposed to China if you're building pretty much anything in an industrial sense these days. So that's an interesting and specific use case. And what we find is that the major industrials that are managing this well are ones that are trying to get very specific about what is our supply chain like today, but even more important than that, what will it be like in 2 to 5 years? Because procurement decisions tend to be long time horizon decisions, it's more important for a big industrial like that to be able to look into the future and make risk-informed decisions about how conditions will be rather than how conditions currently are.
Okay.
So financial services is different. Financial services, and I'll say this as well, financial services has been mature on geopolitical risk for a while. And I think it's because for so long, the sanctions environment has dominated so much of how, under the sort of American neoliberal world ordered, risk was manifested to companies. So for financial services companies, they're pretty used to things like customer due diligence, exposure to risky emerging markets, sanctions compliance, all those kinds of things. Those things used to be fairly predictable. The United States and Europe would, issue sanctions, and you had some amount of time to respond to that and to conduct your due diligence and make sure you're not exposed. And to some extent, it made sense to be a little ahead of where the Western capitals were going on sanctions so that you could avoid those entanglements altogether. The thing that I think you're seeing now that's a challenge for the FinServ model is that the way that order is manifested is fracturing. So you have now Washington interested in implementing sanctions in ways that diverge from the ways that sanctions are implemented in Brussels, diverging again from the way that, rising financial powers might think about them. So the Chinese, have not really used this as a tool, but it is something you could increasing in the years ahead. That makes it difficult if you do business across all these jurisdictions. It makes it difficult for you to understand, legal compliance is one thing. If a big government has told you you're not allowed to do something, that's pretty cut and dried. But it's harder for you to understand what's a safe investment, what's a risky investment. I look at the Gulf state investments, particularly into AI, which, a couple of years ago, that would have seemed like a no-brainer. But it's hugely exposed to risk, particularly reputational risk and political risk, because there are different interests at stake here, and you might be getting yourself into some interesting situations. So that has fragmented a little bit the model that financial entities carried out before as their risk management process for geopolitics. And then I mentioned I wanted to talk about tech companies a little bit, because I think coming from a tech company previously myself, there's an instinct, particularly among the big American tech companies, to think of themselves as not existing in the real world, to think of themselves as cyberspace entities. That may be true. I would say that data centers being sort of blown up in the Middle East kind of expose the lie there. But I would also say that cyberspace is itself, a domain. It's a territory under which geopolitics is being played out. And you see divergences between the United States and Europe over technology regulation, data privacy, all these things now becoming a huge fault line that the American tech companies were not prepared for, despite the fact that the writing was on the wall. Even before the second Trump administration, the writing was on the wall that there was a divergence happening in those key markets. So, it's different in every case what the risk looks like. And so the mitigations are also different as well, because a supply chain focused response to geopolitical risk is different from a reputational digital sovereignty response.
I'm thinking whilst you talk. This leads me to the question, there's so much information out there, of course. How do boards know what to monitor and really how to separate signals from pure noise?
I think it's important to go beyond the news cycle here, because as you say, the world is very loud these days. It used to be that intelligence work, thinking about the future, was all about finding signal or finding data, right? Collecting data. There was not enough information available. Can we get more information and more information? And if we can, we'll inherently get signals that will tell us more than our competitors. That's not the case anymore. The world is so awash in data and information that it's not about finding information. It's about parsing what information is actually valuable. So a big challenge of relying on the news cycle is you're at the whim of whatever the news organizations have decided is the most important thing for you to know. And inherently, they're not speaking to your business. They're speaking to a broad audience. So the only way you can really identify what is signal and what is noise to you is to first understand your business really well. Then you can begin asking the right questions. In the government, I used to be an intelligence analyst, and we would call this setting intelligence requirements. And it was a super important part of our process because it meant going to all the stakeholders that we had and really challenging them. Hey, we can't answer every question for you. We don't have the time and the resources. So give us a list of what are your most important questions. What do you need to know about the world in order to make decisions? That really helped us scope in where we would spend our focus and the kind of information we would send to them so that we weren't burying them with irrelevant data. Now, it's a little challenging in the private sector because if you go to a board or to a set of company directors and you say, what questions do you have about geopolitics? You're probably going to get a bunch of blank looks, right? So you need to be really tangible to the organization already when you're setting these requirements. Where are we uniquely weak as an organization? Where would we suffer most if something were to go wrong? Think the unthinkable here too. You can ask provocative questions that people think are crazy. You can say, what if tomorrow World War III breaks out between the US and China? What would that mean for us as an organization? You'll probably get still some questionable looks, but it'll give you super useful information about, okay, now that I know that our business is uniquely exposed to this one data center in Australia, it can inform what kind of data sources I go and seek out in the world to monitor for risk to that specific exposure. Maybe it's a local newspaper in a small town in Australia that turns out to be the most useful piece of information that I check every day that, 99.999% of other people in the world are ignoring because they're reading The Economist, but it turns out that was the one I needed.
So how can a board really ensure that it's getting the right information at the right cadence without being absolutely overwhelmed?
I think this starts with delegation. I think at the board level, it's super important that the board members hold people down the chain of command in the business responsible for doing the right thing and managing these risks well. I think at the beginning, it requires more input from the board to make sure that a geopolitical risk strategy has been designed and been implemented. But once it has been, and once it's functioning, I think the reporting requirements can probably decrease. There will be times during which there is greater risk. And I think at those times, you want the board to be responsive to receiving whatever agenda items are most operational for it. But then there will also be a lot of times where nothing significant to report is adequate as a response. But I think the institutional muscle needs to be there already and running all the time, because if you wait until there are issues, the problems will be outsized compared to if you were able to detect them early. So it's a bit of a it depends answer. But I think if somebody tries to legislate to you as a board member, you should receive a briefing on geopolitical risk every month, that may not suit your use case. You might need it daily, you might need it yearly. So I really think that doing the intellectual work for yourself up front and thinking, what's the scale of our risk and what's the scale of reporting that we need to make good decisions, that is the most valuable input you can give as a senior leader or as a board member at the top of an organization.
This morning, I spoke with some people who work in the German Mittelstand, so mid-sized companies, but global leaders in what they do. But of course, they don't have the size of a Salesforce. They have limited resources. What can these mid-sized companies realistically really put in place?
I'm glad you asked this because it's something I think a lot about. For a big company, if a big company mismanages a geopolitical risk, it will cost them a lot of money, but it probably won't be existential. They'll probably be able to survive it. For a medium or small size company, that's not the case. A geopolitical disruption could be the end of a company like that. So in many ways, they have less resources to deal with the challenge, but they're also the ones that need to deal with it the most. And this is one of the reasons that I actually ended up leaving big tech to go to a startup, was because I felt like the way that geopolitical risk was being managed was not scalable, and that it needed to be built in a more scalable way so that people at all levels could access it. So, I mentioned a lot already that the traditional consulting solutions, throwing a lot of headcount at a problem, those things can work, but only if you have the resources to do them. What I'm really interested in now, and what we build at Clock&Cloud, are software solutions that are much more scalable, that are much more lean, that enable companies that don't have the resources to throw at this problem to be pretty sophisticated on managing their own risks anyway. What that looks like in practice is, rather than relying on a team within your organization with dedicated headcount, rather than relying on a big consulting firm to audit you and to tell you about your geopolitical risk, you instead bring your data to the platform, you upload it, you maintain it there, and then we are using our risk lens, overlaying that against your particular footprint. And then you only get the answers that are relevant to you versus getting the answers that are relevant to an entire industry, right? And that's something that we can deliver much more cheaply and effectively with a lean model, with a software as a service model, than we could deliver it as a consulting solution where we have to maintain a huge headcount of specialized analysts.
Let's not get too deep into this, but as we both know, SaaS companies are also squeezed at the moment because a lot of people basically believe AI can solve these issues. So if you listen to this now and say, we don't want to buy another SaaS tool, maybe Claude or Perplexity or whoever can help me to solve these problems.
I think that's a understandable perspective, especially with the rise of vibe coding. You see a lot of these vibe coded tools that people will make, and they look super shiny and they're impressive because of all the blinking lights and flashing indicators and things like that. I think, so to answer your question directly, there is nothing stopping anyone from using AI to build really interesting, innovative tools to solve their problems. And that is a huge challenge to legacy SaaS, which is used to having a huge headcount of engineers to maintain and build these tools. What I would challenge, though, is that unless you have a very strong model, how your specific high fidelity data is used by the AI to then overlay against specific high fidelity data of the risk, you probably will get a lot of AI slop. AI is really good at telling you what you want to hear. For risk prediction, often what you have to tell people is not what they want to hear. So we use a number of AI tools at Clock&Cloud to help us build the SaaS tool that we do. It's something that helps us be super lean, for example, which we think is a huge advantage in the environment we're going into. And we think that's a handicap for the big legacy SaaS companies. But the thing that we do around all of our AI solutions is put really tight guardrails around what data they're allowed to access and what their context windows look like. If you can't get an AI to only use your company's specific footprint versus a very specific proprietary data set of here's where the risk is in the world, it's going to give you pretty generic and often kind of hallucinated make-believe answers. So with anyone, I would say if you're evaluating a really shiny, cool AI-generated geopolitical risk tool, That's great. Give it a look. Make sure you ask a lot of hard questions about what's the data that's feeding into this? What are your guardrails around making sure it's not going to hallucinate stuff or make stuff up? How do you keep this specific to my business versus to a generic audience? All of those are questions that will give you some idea of, is the person that you're engaging with, the vendor you're engaging with, do they have a whole schematic model that will work well and repeatably into the future looking forward? Or do they just have something that's a technology demonstrator that shows you a problem of today with a bunch of sort of data feeds coming in and blinking lights and things like that?
Well, fantastic. Again, I'm looking at the clock here. What are the final thoughts you would like to leave our listeners with? And maybe, the big question always at the end, what are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this specific episode?
I think the main argument that I'd like to make is, despite how many people now are appearing on the market and claiming to be experts about this, nobody has solved this problem completely. It's a bit of a greenfield area still. There's still tons of room for experimentation and change. I would encourage board members that are listening to this to connect with peers in the industry who they feel are doing this well. If you can think about your peers, is there someone that you think is solving this problem, or even just thinking about this problem in a way that is innovative that you think might be useful? If you notice during crisis moments, for example, that one firm seems to have come out of everything relatively unscathed, or maybe they weren't as panicked as everybody else, or they made a big market move ahead of something that happened, that's a sign that that's a firm that's taking this stuff seriously and maybe has a bit of a competitive advantage in how they're thinking about it. So that's something to watch for. Again, I'll go back to what I said in the last episode. There's a sense in the business community that these are unprecedented times, but the reality is they're just a return to normal history. So there will be folks out there that have a bit of a better handle on how to handle this stuff. And I think it's a constant evolution. I think knowing yourself and knowing what's out there on the market and knowing how others are handling this, if you put those 3 things together, you're going to be moving in the right direction, even if we can't avoid every risk all the time.
Colin, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think lots of thought-provoking sentences, insights, and I really thank you for contributing to the Better Bots podcast series.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the perspective here, and this is a conversation I'm passionate about, so I really hope we keep it going.
Thanks so much, Colin. I hope you enjoyed our little mini-series on geopolitical risk, and I hope that it sparks thoughts and actions. This little series is part of the Better Bots podcast series brought to you by Better Bots. We are providing board evaluation solutions. Get in touch if you would like to hear more about our work, or if you would like to see a demo of our innovative board evaluation platform. We at Better Bots are always delighted to hear from you. So reach out, get in touch, get involved. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you for listening.